Wait, is that a mic? Is that microphone on? Yeah. Is the microphone on? Yeah, it is. Perfect. Hello, good evening, and welcome to Chatham House. My name is David Gunn, and I head up the Sustainability Accelerator here. And we've been working with Laurie and the rest of the team over the last couple of years to incubate the Strategic Climate Risks Initiative. There's a lot of smiling in the audit. By the way, I know we're here for derailment risk, but I'm glad that we've started. You're like radiating happiness at me. That's a good start. So we, at the Accelerator, we describe our work as seeking to catalyze new frontiers for the transition. Much of that work is inherently positive in tone, shot through really with a deep belief in our individual and collective powers to invent, imagine, and realize better futures. But we also do it, I think, deeply aware of the historical moment in which we find ourselves, one that is witnessing the breach of 1.5 with all of the non-linear climate impacts that ushers in, as well as deep and ongoing disruptions and dislocations in our order at a kind of local, national, and international level. And I think in that context, we're profoundly grateful for work of folks like the SCRI, who are working to help leaders and all of us, not only to understand the current dynamics of our situation, but also to identify practical implications and responses that can be taken. And it's in that spirit that I welcome you here this evening. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you find it enlightening, but most importantly, I hope you find it helpful. Before I hand over to Laurie and the panel, just a couple of sort of housekeeping notes. Firstly, although I anticipate this evening might include the expression of alarm at multiple levels, there is no fire alarm that is planned for this evening. So if you do hear a fire alarm, it is proper. There are two, round of applause already, yeah, thank you. There are two fire alarms, fire exits, one on that side, one on that side. Please follow the directions of Chatham House folks who will direct you in either direction. Tonight's discussion is not held under the Chatham House rule, so please feel free to share and attribute anything you hear this evening. Please share it on socials and wherever else you would like to. And also, after the conversation in the panel, there will be drinks upstairs. If you need any assistance at any point during that, or if you would like to find out more about the work of the Accelerator, please track down a person with a blue lanyard and we will be happy to help you. And with that studious and relatively short introduction, I would like you to join me in welcoming to the stage this evening's panel.
Oh, good evening, everyone. Thanks for clapping, because it's always extremely awkward when you walk up on here after an introduction. It's all very quiet. Welcome to Chatham House from me, for those of you here in person, as well as those of you online, somewhere up there in the ether. Thank you for joining us this evening for our event on derailment risk. More on that in a moment. My name's Laurie Laybourne. I'm the Executive Director of the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative. It's a relatively new think and do tank that's focusing on what next for climate change as the consequences escalate and how we might navigate climate action through that. And I'm also an Associate Fellow here at the Sustainability Accelerator at Chatham House, which, as David said, supported us in our incubation stage. Our agenda this evening is we're going to have our amazing panel with a bunch of people, both here in person and online, whose work I have long followed and admired. And then for those of you in person, we will then be, as David said, processing upstairs for a drinks reception and something a bit more interactive, which I'll talk about in a bit. And for those of you online, we will, of course, not get in the way of you having a drink after this panel as well. As David said, this is on the record. We will have a discussion after our opening panel reflections. For those of you in person, there will be roving mics for that. And for those of you online, you should be able to use the Q&A function on Zoom. And I have a laptop next to me that will mean that I can come to your questions. So I'm delighted to have such an amazing panel with me. Before I introduce them, some context. It's a tough time for the climate struggle right now. I mean, just looking at the news today, we have the UN Secretary General in an interview published through The Guardian and other outlets, joining that chorus that is pointing out that We're in the process of overshooting the 1.5 degree global goal. We have the latest analysis of country plans, climate plans, that are to be presented at the upcoming UN Climate Conference, and those are not going so well. And then we have the truly horrific scenes of the hurricane in the Caribbean Sea, which I think is expected shortly to hit landfall in Jamaica with probably catastrophic consequences. And we have our thoughts and prayers, I'm sure you'll all agree with me on this, to those who are there, and wishing them all the very best for what happens next. These are indicative of what a number of people, including us at the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative, call a new climate reality. And that is one typified by things hitting harder and at the soonest end of what we might predict, and worse is to come. But that doesn't mean the game is up. It means that the context for climate action is getting that much more challenging, and the question is how we might navigate far more ambitious climate action through those conditions. And that's what we're here to talk about tonight. In this moment of peril and toughness, we're going to talk about how we might navigate through that. So our question tonight is, how can we protect and maybe even deepen climate action even as climate consequences spiral? So we're talking about agency, our ability to act now and going forward. And that brings me to that derailment risk phrase that we used in the event description. SCRI has just finished a project that we led along with our amazing partners at the University of Exeter, at the University College London Climate Action Unit, and at the Institute for Public Policy Research, that looked at this thing we call derailment risk. And there's a lot in that project, and there's a report out that you guys can look at. But one of the main messages we wanted to push was that we need to think more about some of the feedback loops that affect our agency now and into the future. Those feedback loops, some of them, can be virtuous. They can be virtuous cycles where the consequence of climate change can actually reinforce climate action. And we see evidence of this all around. We see evidence of worsening climate impacts driving effectively a wake-up call and pushing people more toward voting, say, for pro-climate political parties. And of course, we see the feedback loops in green technology, where the more of it that is produced then leads to learning effects, which makes it cheaper, meaning there's greater demand, which then means there's more production, and you get a virtuous cycle there. But there are also vicious cycles as well. And this is what we call derailment risk. The idea that as the consequences get worse, like worsening climate impacts, it could end up creating a situation that frustrates climate action. And one example of this, a weak signal of this, that we mention in our work in the report that we published today, is the events that occurred 1 year ago tomorrow in the Valencia region in Spain, where a climate-driven disaster, one of the worst in Spanish history, ended up, unexpectedly, boosting the prospects of climate-denying politicians. We see this as a kind of warning from a future, a more climate-impacted future, in which it won't necessarily fall the way that we want it to as those impacts rain down. So, that is one contribution we're making to this discussion. And later, for those in person, when we have our drinks, you will be able to get a taster of a facilitation tool that our wonderful colleagues at the UCL Climate Action Unit have developed to help you map derailment risks in your particular setting and explore how you might tackle those risks. So when we go out for drinks later, do go, we'll be able to show you where it is, but go in and have a little play around with that toolkit. Okay, enough from me. We're here mainly to hear from our panelists and to then have a discussion with you guys in the audience in person and online. So I am absolutely delighted to introduce these four wonderful people. They are many things, they do many things, so the bio I'm going to read now does not represent the depth of their experience and also the astonishing number of affiliations they all have. So very quickly, over to my far left, we have Dr. James Dyke, who is Assistant Director at the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter and one of our co-authors on our derailment risk report that was released today. Next to me here in person, we have Emma Howard-Boyd, CBE, who is the Chair of the London Climate Resilience Review. Online, we have Professor Thomas Homer-Dixon, TAD, as I know him, Executive Director of the Cascades Institute. And then we have Kate McKenzie as well, who is co-founder and editor of The Polycrisis, a brilliant newsletter And for those of you on Discord, a brilliant Discord as well, so do check that one out. We are going to follow the traditional setup of getting some opening reflections from each of our panelists. They're going to be quick, they're going to be under 5 minutes, or they're going to see me getting very frustrated. And then we're going to come out to you guys as an audience to get some questions and thoughts from you in person and online. So, without further ado, after a lot from me, James, could I invite you to go first, please, with your opening reflections on agency and what comes next with climate change?
I will. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all this evening. So it's Chatham House rules. So I can't really.
No, on the record. On the record.
Oh no, sorry. It's not Chatham House rules.
We're on the record.
Okay. Well then I'm
definitely.
I'm not going to tell you what I really think.
That's exactly what we wanted to achieve with it being on the record.
So,
well done.
Well, I'll spend the next 5 minutes blowing smoke up your arse about 1.5 and tell you it's fine, we're going to overshoot, large-scale carbon dioxide removal, temperature shaving with geoengineering, and we're going to arrive at the safety zone by the end of the century. Along the way, however, I do want to emphasize that the warmer that it becomes, the more important what we do becomes. So human agency actually increases. There's this notion that we go beyond certain tipping points in the climate. I'm going to talk about one of them very briefly. And then everything is lost. And perhaps there is, at some point in our maybe not too distant future, a whole series of interactions which means that we would have lost the climate and we might have even lost civilization, but we are not there yet. We are quite some distance away from there, hopefully, unless we've catastrophically underestimated risk. So one of the reasons why agency matters is because of feedback loops, and that's what derailment risks ultimately are. They're about the management or identification of feedback loops. So you probably know already that of all the carbon that we put into the atmosphere, about half of that gets removed for free by the carbon sinks both on land and in the sea. And that's great, which means that we've got half the amount of climate change that we would see otherwise. An important carbon sink is based on the land. It's in the Amazon region. We've got billions of tons of carbon locked up in all those soils and biomass. Unfortunately, as it's becoming warmer, it's becoming hotter and drier, and so some of that carbon is becoming a source. It's actually leaking back into the atmosphere. So the Amazon is switching from a kind of a process which removes carbon from the atmosphere and is actually putting it up there. And when we look at the really bad case scenarios of climate change, then we can see significant dieback of the Amazon, in which that will greatly amplify the amounts of warming that humans have already produced, right? So this is an example of a tipping point. Earlier in the year, in fact quite recently, there was the latest Global Tipping Points report published. It makes for extremely grim reading because in many respects I think we have grossly underestimated the risk of these tipping points being activated above 1.5 degrees Celsius. But what it also goes on to talk about is the potential for reinforcing feedback loops in social systems. So what we do as a response to climate change is actually perhaps much, much, much more important than what the climate is going to do. So we talk about climate change impacts, kind of first order impacts. So Laura's already mentioned one. There is a storm that is going to kill probably a not insignificant number of people. And the number of people that it's going to kill as it makes landfall is going to be larger than in a counterfactual world in which we'd not have seen climate change. Because with more energy in the climate system, storms are becoming more powerful, more destructive, more deadly. We're seeing more people die as a consequence of heat stroke. There's going to be impacts on food systems. These are what we call first order immediate consequences of climate change, but it's the unfolding impacts as they cascade out across society that I'm sure Tad later on is going to be talking about, and hopefully we can talk about, because it's our ability to manage those feedback loops as the consequence of social disruption. If we get that right, I think we can keep on a path of accelerating the phase out of fossil fuels, increasing adaptation, and somehow navigate through this storm, that we arrive, maybe by the middle towards the end of this century, in a safe place. If we get it wrong, if the consequences of climate change begin to impact our abilities to deal with the drivers of climate change, then we see a situation of derailment risk where the situation could spiral rapidly out of control. And that's what we hopefully will be talking about later this evening.
Thank you, James. And so, you know, we're fundamentally talking about the non-linearity, the risks that are non-linear, and we therefore need to have an agency that is also non-linear in response to that, right?
Yes.
Spot on. Well, that's exactly what I was hoping you would say on the record. Okay, we're now going to come online, and we're going to go to Kate, who has joined us in the early hours of a Sydney morning, which we're extremely grateful for. And Kate, it would be lovely to get your opening thoughts on this question of agency as we head deeper into the literal and figurative climate storm. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to speak on this great report and with such a great panel. Look, this is a really important topic, and as the report notes, it's something that's been neglected or not been given enough attention by people who work in climate policy and climate advocacy. On agency, I think, look, it's probably, I don't like to kind of, criticize what we've done in the past in climate advocacy because unlike climate fuel disasters, which James mentions, where we do have counterfactuals, we obviously don't have counterfactuals for things that we've tried that have and haven't worked, and it's really, really difficult problem. But I think that in order to really tackle these feedback loops, these derailment risks that the report identifies, I think that will require some quite big changes that would be more than just or more than adjusting things that we're already doing. Although, as you've also identified there, you and the other authors, there are some, there are virtuous circles as well. I think it is helpful to look at the past a bit and what we've done in the past to kind of really embrace our agency going forward. We have in the past presented climate action, climate mitigation, the really important job of cutting emissions, as I think we've thought of it and presented it as just turning a few dials, swapping out coal-fired electricity generation, gas generation for renewable energy generation, swapping out ICE cars for EVs, things like that. But what we're really seeking to do is change the energy system, the transport system, agriculture system, built environment, probably some other systems I've forgotten here. So we are advancing a vision of a very different future, and we need to be really kind of conscious of that in how we go about it. This is going to mean big shifts, and there's winners and losers in any big shifts. And I think some of the risks, some of the derailment risks, some of the vicious cycles that are identified in the report are around the fact that just like the magnitude of what needs to be done is huge. We would need we need to do quite a lot of things. One of the things that the report mentions is citizens' assemblies, and that's, these are great. I know there's been some really impressive stuff in the UK. It's going to be a lot harder to affect those sorts of fora in countries that are under authoritarian rule, countries where corruption and misinformation have run wild. I mean, this actually is a lot of countries, right? Or just countries where the far right is increasingly powerful in elected governments. We're going to need to move away from technocratic focus, away from some of these very abstracted kind of scenarios, or at least, contain them a bit more to specialist field and focus more on how we really can bring, more people with us. What would it take? I've thought about, what would it take to have a broader climate advocacy landscape, scientists, campaigners, policymakers, politicians that can affect such huge changes. I think a manifesto for addressing derailment risk, it's not going to look like an IPCC report. It's not going to look like an academic paper. It's going to look more like the notorious Project 2025, or it's going to look perhaps more hopefully like the Gen Z protesters in Nepal, Madagascar, Bangladesh, Morocco, lots of few other countries in the last year, where where there is like a very kind of popular uprisings that are actually pretty anchored in some concrete asks. So yeah, we're going to have to adopt some new things, let go of some things that we have done and some approaches that we've had before, and listen to people that we've ignored, find solidarity with people who would tend to side against us. But we also have to figure out how to work around and without the sort of people and the forces that are just never gonna get on board. And we're seeing that in the US, obviously, like figures who would really happily rather destroy the world or the habitability of it for a large percentage of the population, rather than see sort of peaceful, equitable progression for humanity, which I think is still possible. So yeah, those were the thoughts that the report prompted for me, and yeah, looking forward to talking more about it.
Thank you, Kay. And I would really push people to check out the Polycrisis newsletter, if not just because it is an astonishing sort of almost feeling like frontline intel source, particularly around the industrial strategies of nations around the world, which I think is a key part of this navigational capability for what is increasingly happening now. Thanks, Kay. We'll come back to you with our questions in a second. Tad, over to you at a lovely leisurely lunchtime in Canada, I think, and thanks for joining us from there. Your thoughts on this subject, Tad, over to you.
Thank you so much, Laurie. Yes, it's a reasonable time here, 1:22 p.m. in Toronto, so I'm delighted to be with you all. So I think the question as it's posed for this evening for you is vitally important. How do we maintain agency? Because the derailment risk feedback loops are fundamentally about the erosion of agency. And so I want to put a little bit of arithmetic together for folks here, drawing on some of the thinking about agency in political science and comparative politics, which is one of my foundational disciplines. So most comparative politicians, political scientists who are looking at, say, the development of popular movements would relate agency to two large sort of macro variables. One would be the degree of will that is present in the agents, and the second would be the degree of opportunity that is available to those agents. So in terms of arithmetic or simple math, it's sort of will times agency. Will times opportunity produces the degree of agency. And opportunity can be often thought of in terms of the resources available to the agents, what capacity they have to act. If they are motivated and if they're interested in doing something about a particular problem like climate change, do they have the capacity to act? And in particular, what kind of financial and other resources would they have available to enable their action? So will times opportunity or will times resources. And I think one of the key things that the research on the derailment risk has identified, and I almost said debilitation there because I've also been using this term debilitation loop, but it's exactly the same sort of idea, derailment risk debilitation loop. I think one of the key things that this work has identified is the specific pathways by which climate change and climate extremes and disasters can interfere with both will and the provision of resources to address climate change. So two major pathways, one pathway that affects the will that is needed for agency and one pathway that affects the resources. And I think one of the key things that needs to be highlighted in this conversation is that the will portion often gets neglected. There's a lot of focus on opportunity and resources and how those get undermined, but the psychological and social psychological impacts are often neglected. So on the opportunity/resources side of that little equation, the big impacts are often on capital diversion, that extreme weather events and climate problems divert capital away from the research that's necessary and the other things, technological developments, and divert capital to dealing with the immediate impacts on, for instance, infrastructure and health, rather than dealing with the longer term investment that's necessary to, for instance, transition the economy towards low carbon output. So the capital diversion that happens weakens the resources, weakens the opportunity to express agency effectively in response to climate change. And then on the will side of the equation, and the will variable, if you want to call it that, I think there are two particular impacts. And I think this is where the derailment risk model is particularly helpful in highlighting these. One is that competition over resources arising from climate impacts within societies and between societies can lead to loss of social solidarity, contention between social groups and even between societies, which increases the difficulty of creating the public goods that are necessary to solve collective action problems. It actually just basically makes the problem of the challenge of solving problems that much harder. Conflict undermines collective action. And then the second component, in the second way that climate change affects will, or the motivation to be an agent, is through despair, the loss of hope, the loss of a sense of possibility of the future, increasingly seems to be occluded or eclipsed by the challenge of climate change. And I think we're seeing this enormously, very acutely with many young people around the world, and a kind of shift to fatalism. And frankly, fatalism is fatal to agency. So again, climate change is affecting motivation, or the will that's necessary for agency, by increasing social dissension and conflict and contention, which leads to undermining the ability to develop the public goods, the institutions necessary for problem solving. And it's also leading to the social, psychological, and the psychological impacts of despair. And so we have capital diversion, conflict, and despair. Climate change, and just to wrap up, is a massive market failure, essentially, that can't be solved without government and public institutions that are credible, competent, and strong. But capital diversion, conflict, and despair grievously erode the legitimacy and capacity of those government institutions. I think that in terms of our responses, what the critical things that the derailment risk research program has done is actually highlight these feedback loops so they're more visible, and that they can become the focus of public policy and public interventions. It's specifically focused on the issues of maintaining capital availability, dealing with the psychological impacts of despair, and reducing the dissension and conflict arising from climate change, to break that feedback loop that's undermining the ability of governments and societies to solve problems. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Tad. And again, a plug for the Cascades Institute that Tad leads. They do fantastic work, looking in particular at feedback loops and these dynamics of the wider polycrisis. Let's come back into the room here in person. Emma, I'm going to come to you now. In the green room, we were asking you who would be the most upbeat person on the panel. Is that going to be you then, as we come to your remarks now?
Oh, that's so unfair, Laurie.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't say that
I've
before.
been sitting here listening to my fellow panelists working out the best way to come in on this discussion. And I think for me, having spent most of my career as an executive working in finance, and then more recently over the last decade or so in the public sector, specifically leading the Environment Agency as chair. And the Environment Agency here in the UK is an environmental regulator, but it also has responsibility for flood and coastal erosion risk management. So I've been out in my Wellington boots after floods, meeting with people who have been flooded, not just once, but on multiple occasions, and then leading the London Climate Resilience Review, which was published in 2024 for the Mayor of London after a series of flood events, but then following those flood events, surface water flooding events in 2021, a summer of unexpected 40-degree heat shortly after a report that was published by the Committee on Climate Change with Met Office data saying that we wouldn't experience 40-degree heat in this country, and then for at least a decade, and then a few months later, there we were, basking in 40-degree heat. But also the cascading risks of prolonged dry weather as the heat went up, people starting using water more, so 50% increase in water usage. Suddenly we're moving into drought, then a ring of fire all the way around London, the busiest day for the London Fire Brigade since the Second World War, and then breaking with rain and surface water flooding. So for me, this whole discussion has to be grounded in how people, real people, are now experiencing these impacts everywhere. And I think today is a very, very sobering day. Back around COP26, the Glasgow COP, I was working with the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, and one of the countries that we were working with was Jamaica, about making some of their infrastructure resilient to climate change. So I think the hours and days to come will show how whether that worked and what that means for other countries really on the front line of the climate impacts that we are seeing today. And so for me, this whole agency question is, how are we going to operate very, very differently in this new climate reality, talking about these impacts that are happening today, not in the future, getting worse. And making sure that we are joining up those silos that we know exist and some of us have been talking about for far too long. So if I take the London Climate Resilience Review, I was overwhelmed by the different parts of London, the different sectors of London that engaged with it. But we still find ourselves in this country with a 10-year infrastructure strategy announced in June this year, with a couple of paragraphs on climate risks and how we take those into account. There are sections on the investment that is going to go into flood protection, 7.8 or 9 billion pounds. But only 2 paragraphs reflecting on the 725 billion pounds that is going to be spent on new infrastructure for the rest of this decade. So what are we going to do to make sure that we're not locking in that vulnerability and can make sure that we're not seeing that new investment, let alone all the stuff that we need to retrofit or maintain, locking in ongoing vulnerability, play into these derailment risks that you so eloquently talk about in your report. Because this is where it's going to get real. This is where in one country we have choices that we can make. And we're seeing the finance community put money on the table. Only last week, or possibly the week before, when the Chancellor got together with a group called the Sterling 20 here in the UK, you had institutional investors in the insurance, world of insurance, putting money on the table to invest in infrastructure. Some of those organisations are also publishing reports talking about the flood risk, the heat risk, the subsidence risk in this country. Are we going to join those dots up and make sure that we're thinking about climate resilience, adaptation, and the role of nature in doing this? That is how we're going to start navigating this next period, well or not, if we're brave enough to keep on challenging those decisions, whether it's government, local government leaders, the private sector, the things that we can do as leaders. And that's where I think we've just got to talk much more openly and boldly about the decisions we're making today, and are they going to be the right decisions to help us navigate through the next decades to come.
Thank you very much, Emma. And I think one thing I particularly learned from your work is not just that importance of the need to be closing this adaptation gap that we know we have in huge respects around the world, including here in Britain, but how that can not just be about protection, but also be more of the offense as well, because many of the things that we need to become better adapted are also things that can be co-beneficial with reducing emissions as well, and that's key to that navigational thing now. I'm not going to abuse my position as chair to ask a bunch of questions. Let's get it out for more of a discussion on this sort of querulous evening, and with this big idea of how we can not just maintain but deepen our agency as we head further over 1.5, as nonlinear risks begin to spiral, how we can see things through here on out. So let's get some thoughts in the room. What I'll do while people have a think is I will come online to engage with our audience who are there in the ether, and I will come to a question from Andrew here, who has called me out by saying that the climate plans for COP30, I said, are not going well. He says that that is the understatement of the year. Fair play. And he asks, is the UNFCCC process still fit for purpose? A question that, of course, comes up sometimes in discussions of this subject matter, and particularly before COP. And I'm going to take another from online as well. So anyone online or in person, have a think about whether they want to come in on the COP process and its ability to help our agency here on out. And then we have Dan Hoyer as well, who says a fantastic point from Kate about the Gen Z protesters and their specific and legitimate asks. What are the ways that we in science and the research community can nourish those movements and aid the translation of their asks into real policy and so on? So one question on the COP process and its role in our agency, and the other one on how research can support this proliferation of younger generation movements that we are seeing the latest iteration of. Who would like to have a stab at those on our panel here? I'm not surprised. Tad, let's go to you, and then Kate, I'll come to you after. Tad.
So the Gen Z protesters, one wants to hope, right? But we have to keep in mind that what's happening in many of these cases is that the response has been A, brutal, and B, has been a turn towards, for instance, in Madagascar, a military regime, right? In many respects, this is actually an open example, a real live example of debilitation risk. That you've had a collapse of democracy, and it's not clear what's going to happen in Nepal. You've had a collapse of democracy, a loss of institutional capacity, even more so than there was before, and less capacity within these societies to respond effectively to climate impacts, not more. So this internal dissension is actually undermining the capacity of societies. Not that we don't side with the Gen Z protesters in Madagascar. They were substantially motivated by climate impacts and the economic effects of climate impacts. Of course, we're on their side, but it's actually a live example of debilitation, of the derailment risk feedback loop. And so I think we should be careful in a sense what we hope for here.
Thanks. And Kate, any thoughts from your end?
Yeah, I don't know. I disagree with that. Really, I think like we are where we are, right? If people are organising, then this is better than taking it passively, which is what we're seeing in some of these countries that supposedly have stronger institutions in the West. Again, not to make the obvious example of the US. On the question, on the question of what researchers can do, scientists, look, I don't know. We've got two, eminent researchers on this panel, Tad and James, who do, a lot of outreach. I know James does a lot of communication, like really great writing, connecting the dots, and Tad's work obviously is also, doing a lot of important interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary dot joining. I think that's definitely part of it. And look, it's a tough one. I think most of the researchers are not really busy, on the UNFCCC question though, look, it's a good question, but I think. Well, I think it really depends. What do you think the UNFCCC set out to do? What should it be doing? What's our ideal scenario for what a dedicated, truly multilateral forum on climate change would look like? I think to say it's not fit for purpose is, obviously we would like it to be much, much, much better. But I don't think there's much to be gained from just saying, it's not working. We should, we should just resile from it altogether. So look, it's a tricky one. I think it's something that exists. It's probably better. Institutions are really important, as Tad just said. So it's probably better to build it up, or change it, help it adapt and evolve. It is, there is a bit of that happening. There's a bit more connection to other things, international financial architecture, for example, something I'm quite interested in. MDB, multilateral development banks, like some of these things are becoming more integrated into the discourse and even the outcomes there. So it is evolving, but it's a tough one, right?
Thanks, Kate. And James, you want to come in quickly on the protest point?
One thing that academics and researchers could do would be to summon the courage to step over this invisible line that separates their academic or research practice to wider society. The work that gets done in these integrated assessment models and the scenarios around 1.5, I mean, these are just fantastical nonsense. And when you've got a significant part of the academic community underpinning work that's meant to be policy relevant, which is just completely detached from reality, I think it's a great injustice that's being met to younger people in future generations, because nobody believes any of this stuff, right? What we need, what the situation demands, is a radical phase out of fossil fuels, and that's where the emphasis should be placed on research. And if that's not deemed to be policy relevant, then find other ways to change policy and society such it actually matches reality.
Thanks, James. Emma.
And I think it's really important to look at local leaders as well as those national governments and how they get together at the COP, in the COP process. I think this is an area where you can see real stuff happening, not consistently everywhere, but where you do have bold leadership. And it's that action, that doing things, that joining up the green energy and industrial revolution with climate resilience and positive natural environment steps, that you can see stuff happening at local government level. And so it's been really great to see those, the mayors, the governors rise up the agenda, not just in the COP process, but in the work that they're doing around the world.
Yeah. Great, thank you guys. Let's get some in person. We've already got a couple of people with mics here. We've got one there, and then at the very other extreme of the room, I've got a mic. So Dustin, over to you first.
Thanks very much. Dustin Benton, Forefront Advisors. My question is about reversion to the mean. The sense I have from talking to climate policy folks, and I've been in this space for a while, is that there's this natural assumption that if we just kind of chill out, the Earth system will kind of stay roughly where it is, which is radically at odds with what the science actually says, particularly of tipping points and climate feedback loops. So my question is, do we have political examples of where we as society have anticipated that we're not going to revert to the mean, or have chosen to tell a story about not reverting to the mean and then creating agency using that? Because my sense is if we have some good examples there, we might be able to learn a thing or two about not assuming that we'll go back to 1.5 and that'll be safe, or somehow the tipping points that climate science is throwing at us will leave us in the happy state of the Earth roughly around when I was born, which is, I think, most people kind of anchor their what the climate ought to look like.
Okay, no, that's it's a great prompt. Let's get some ideas on that, of where we might have anticipated some of these wildcards in the past. We'll come over here to Theo. And then did we have someone just behind as well? Yeah, and then we'll go there as well. So we'll take these three very quickly.
Thanks to the panel for great comments. To state the obvious, intervening in key derailment feedback loops is going to cost loads of money. And I'm not thinking just about physical adaptation, but also protecting populations from cascading impacts to their welfare through the price mechanism and more widely. And I think we also have strong signals, most notably the recent abandonment of the billions to trillions aspiration by the Bretton Woods institutions, that the private sector is not going to be the sole saviour of this, which leaves the state with a massive bill. And we also have states, modern rich world states, which are almost uniquely and historically constrained by private bond markets and private capital markets in the level of ambition in terms of economic policy that they can pursue. So given this double bind, where do those of us working in public policy find agency?
Yeah, what way? Quite. Brilliant question there on the resourcing requirements, and then we'll just take the one just behind Theo as well.
Yes. My question was on pace of fossil fuel phase out and how affordability considerations on energy and just transition are brought in to both rightly bring everyone together, but also are a cause of delay of climate action being faster, and how we manage the social impact there and the narrative of it being a delay, but actually also necessary.
So this is energy also being affordable as well as decarbonised, and that being okay, amazing. We, as ever, we find ourselves in these panels that we put on with 3 huge questions. Who would like to grapple with some of those? So I'm particularly struck by this idea of historical examples where we've not had this reversion to the mean, which I'm going to characterise as kind of wildcard situations that are happening. Dustin will take that. Have we had historical examples where we've anticipated this and crafted narratives around? Anyone want to tackle that? Anyone want to tackle this resource bind that we might find ourselves in, particularly fiscally? And anyone want to talk about how we deal with the requirements of affordability and balancing that with decarbonisation? Who would like to come in on those?
I'll say something briefly about decarbonisation whilst
Please.
Everybody else rapidly thinks about something to say.
Yeah, and then we'll come to Kate.
We need to rapidly phase out fossil fuels. I mean, the good news, if we don't, then eventually the system will resort to the mean. So if we manage to stop all burning of fossil fuels, then all that extra carbon is going to get taken out. The bad news is it's going to take 100,000 years, right? So obviously we need to accelerate it. The notion of climate justice is that you do that in a fair and equitable way. And there are a significant fraction of the global population, if you just remove fossil fuels from them, they will be cold, they'll be hungry. And in fact, a significant fraction of the population could actually die because fossil fuels underpin our, hello cat, underpin the very food systems, right? So that, to go on to Theo's point, would suggest there needs to be a very significant role for the state, because you've got to transition away entire sectors, you've got to ensure food security, energy security, water security, which is currently underpinned by large forces of markets and finance. And I currently don't see, through the incremental COP process, how that's really going to be seriously addressed. And that's where you see this tremendous constraint of what's considered to be policy relevant, which is essentially incrementalism, which is just completely not appropriate for where we are, which is now deep into overshoot.
Thanks, James. Kate, did you want to come in next, now that you've given your cat breakfast, maybe?
Yes, thanks. There were so many things there. On the just transition and the question of energy access and energy cost, this is an example that was very rightly highlighted in the report, and I think it has to be taken much more seriously right from the beginning. That does require not something very different from the incrementalism that James just pointed out. I see those things as happening really quite outside the COP process. So not to say I'm a defender of the way things are with the UNFCCC being adequate. Clearly, it's not. But yeah, look, energy systems change. You have to build up a new system. You can't sort of start taking away bits of the existing system. As discussed in the report, something I've written about a lot, cost of energy going up is just absolutely alienating for lots of people, and they are not necessarily going to care that it's not because, that it isn't necessarily caused by a transition to renewable energy. People aren't necessarily going to care that renewable energy will ultimately make their electricity supply cheaper if it's, happening to coincide with costs going up because of the vagaries of the electricity system in most countries, or in a lot of countries, right? Look, this is just essential. Sorry, there was a question about bond markets and a point about that. I think a really, really important point. Policymakers in the countries that benefit from this system, which is, G7 countries, pretty obvious, pretty easy to find out which ones. They're the ones that keep blocking big reforms to the system, like they just did at the Finance for Development conference in Seville a few months ago. That's, Australia, where I am, EU, I think probably Japan, US, that's one place to start looking, I would say.
Great, thanks.
But yeah, it's a big one, really big one and important.
Thank you, Kate. Anyone else on the panel want to come back in? Emma Chikutwick? And then we'll come to Tan. And then we'll take a very quick final round of questions before we can have some drinks here in London.
Yeah. So on the finance one, we're not doing it properly yet. And where individuals do have agency is through their pension funds and could be raising these issues far more fiercely in the way that this is being tackled. Your podcast has an entire episode looking at the financial system and the questions that are now being asked about the assumptions that are being made. I mean, the trouble is the questions that you're asking us are so massive, and the change that is needed are so systemic that it's really difficult to know where to start. But I think if we're going to inject any agency, it is about the holding up the mirror and what is it that I can do in my role to start shifting those dynamics. Otherwise, we just go, we give up. So that is what I would encourage us all to do, is think about what we can do with others to start putting these questions massively on the agenda and using days like today to fire ourselves up, because otherwise the alternative is to just go home and go to bed, which I don't think any of us want to do.
Apart from poor Kate, who is so early in its video. Okay, let's just do a very quick final round here of some questions. So hands up high so I can see all. Oh my goodness, we're just not going to be able to take all these. Okay, we're going to go here in the middle. We'll go to Bernice, and then I'm going to take one online. And I'm really sorry to the rest of you. For those of you in person, we've got lots of time to have more questions to each other. So hang on, we'll keep that mic there with. Hang on. It's all right, you go, then we'll get Bernice, then I'll do online.
I got it, so is it working? Yeah.
Yes.
So eventually the issue of agency came to the state, because at this systemic risk, you need a very strong agent. I mean, I fully agree with individuals and mayors, but you need a very strong agent. And the states at this point, beyond the political disagreements, they don't seem to have enough resources if you consider the long-term effects of climate change. Some of the research, I'm with the Bruegel Institute, and there is a paper saying that climate financing scale, there is enough resources in governments to help for transition, which is true. But there is another research coming saying that if you look at 15, 20 years down the road, the states cannot pay back their debts because of climate impacts. So where are the big agencies? You should look at agents that have enough resources. And I don't think the states already see the problem of the states overburdened and the impacts. Right. I think pension funds that the lady mentioned and insurance companies are the big players that can see the impact down the road.
So I'm going to contort that into a question around which institutions people think have got that greatest agency. Exactly, yes. Great. And we're going to come to, as we transition the mic over to Bernice, I'm going to read one quick question from online. So this is from Tom Ellison, who's at the US-based Center for Climate and Security. They've been doing a lot of great work, another plug, look at it, on misinformation and propaganda. Tom asks, can the panelists speak to their views on promising ways to deal with disinformation campaigns, exploiting climate impacts, and which tools are specific to climate and which are more about our wider information environment? So we've got a question there on tackling misinformation. And I must say that one of the features of this story that we've spoken about when it came to the Valencia region a year ago is the misrepresentation and misinformation about what caused that disaster, what made people vulnerable to that disaster. And there seems to be an emerging playbook of exploiting anger and using misinformation there. Bernice, let's come to you for our final question.
Well, thank you. Sorry, I might be wasting your question because I think Emma might have kind of half answered it. So I'm going to spin it round, which is, in a way, where is the source of agency, but also what can we do tomorrow? So I just want to hear from all of you, where do you think is the largest sources of untapped energy and agency? I think the pension fund is indeed answer to one, so there might be others. I want to hear the panelists in terms of where the untapped ones are, so that we end on a more positive note, so that we can do something about it tomorrow.
Very game of you, Valencia. So, okay, I'm gonna say we've got two questions there. We've got one about misinformation, and then we've got one about those untapped sources, those greatest sources, whether institutional or otherwise, of agency now and into the future. So, Tad, we'll use this as our opportunity to get last reflections from the panelists. So, Tad, do you mind, because I didn't give the opportunity last time, if I then pick on you for you to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Laurie. I'm actually going to try to wrap my answers to these last questions in with my answer comment on one of the previous questions about reversion to a new normal or a reversion to the mean. I think we really need to understand the enormous psychological impacts on people, young people, people around the world of these challenges. The desire to believe that we're going to go back to the past, there'll be a reversion to the mean, or there will be a new normal, it will be stable, we can adapt, is a function of the fear that's being generated by these climate impacts. The sense that that a lot of people share, that we're on kind of a runaway train, that there's no endpoint that could lead to a stable and a stable world of adequate well-being for all of humanity. I think this is an enormous problem that we haven't effectively coped with, except in very few circumstances. The question was asked, are we able to see historical examples of societies that have made the flip to understanding that we are in a radically new situation and be proactive about it and start to adapt to what is coming down the pike instead of trying to go back to the past. And the only circumstances where that's true probably are in circumstances of war, where societies have pulled together in the face of a threat, an implacable threat, and they fully understood the nature of that threat and then have responded effectively. And frankly, I think England is a very good example of the kind of flip that occurred in the late 1930s when it was finally fully recognized to the nature of the threat that the Nazis presented to the world and to England in particular. But notice that there was a long lag time, and then there was a sudden nonlinear shift, and all of a sudden people said, okay, we're in a different world, and now we have to prepare. It's not a particularly salutary or satisfying analogy, but I think it's somewhat relevant to the situation we're in right now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tad. And Kate, can I pick on you to go next, please, with your final remarks?
Yeah, I also have a similar answer to both questions, which is, misinformation, disinformation, been a big problem for a while. I think we're not going to win just by fighting it with better information. We need community. People are guided by their sense of belonging, a lot more, and people are seeking community. This is tricky because it doesn't scale, but it's what we need to think about. It might sound really trite, but I think it's important. And similarly with Bernice's question relating to locations of agency, I'm kind of interested in what Emma thinks about this. Again, because she's seen both finance institutions really, the effectiveness of them versus adaptation, where again, it's like really local, it's necessarily really local. I think adaptation is actually an opportunity, hopefully, for a virtuous cycle, because it necessitates people coming together in a local capacity. So that's my answer to both.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kate. And then can we do James and then Emma?
Yeah. So misinformation is a tool deployed by vested fossil fuel interests in order to stymie or delay climate action. I've been spending years playing whack-a-mole, and you'll never win. The solution is to not try and think of ways to bridge that information deficit gap, but come up with with stories that actually connect with people, stories that move people, stories about the things that people care about. So it's not climate necessarily, it's about notions of justice, about having a good life, about being optimistic and being looking forward into a future. And that demands us we think about what's the point of our societies and our economies, what's the point of the goods and services that they continue to generate if they also drive climate and other planetary boundaries further and further away from any notion of safety, if we risk bringing the whole thing down. So I think that's one thing that the climate communications community has typically failed to do, and it's something that we need to rapidly scale up. And regards to the Second World War example, I'm often in meetings now where we talk about wartime mobilization. Yes, right, and that's an extraordinarily muscular role for the state, right? I mean, it intervenes across all elements of society. But I like the example after the Second World War when it was concluded that if we can completely turn the economy on a 6 months to build tanks, then why can't we build a national health service? And today, the NHS is about as near as you get to a state religion in the United Kingdom. It's one of our greatest achievements, right? That notion of community and coordination to collective ends, that collective endeavour is extraordinarily powerful, and there's no reason why we can't frame climate action and justice in such terms.
Thank you, James. Emma, take us home.
So I'd like to see where we've got pension funds or insurance companies articulating what is at risk in their portfolios, to join that up with when there's money, when they're being asked by governments to put money on the table, as is happening in the UK at the moment, that they're more demanding of the policy framework in which they are making those investments. And then to the community aspect, some of the most moving moments for me when I was visiting flooded communities was how those communities had come together. Often in a church, churches in the UK are often on little hills, but all faith coming together and the local community to support those who've been flooded. And I think that's where we look to other examples, whether it's war, whether it's pandemic, where people come together in moments of crisis to really support each other. And somehow we've got to get on the front foot of that, get climate ready, match ready, ready for what we are going to face, so that when those moments happen, we can support each other through them. And again, that's where local leaders can really come to the fore. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Can I have a round of applause for our wonderful panel? As we may have predicted before this event, we've been grappling with some massively challenging questions this evening at a very challenging time. We've not, of course, answered them or solved them, but what we hope to be doing is contributing to those questions being asked and a next wave of work on how we might navigate what's happening now and particularly next. And I would urge you to check out the work of all of those on the panel this evening, and also to check out our derailment risk work at the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative. You can go to scri.org.uk/derailment. And I'll leave you one last thought, which is that as a part of another project, a podcast documentary that Emma was not paid to mention just now, we use an analogy to help us make sense, maybe, of this moment, which is the analogy of a ship heading towards a storm, the ship representing the world and the storm, various more severe degrees of climate change. And in some ways, the way we've conceived of the challenge has been to get other people on the ship to understand that there's a storm on the horizon, and then to change course and ultimately sail round. We're now in a different situation where the ship is in the storm. The world is in the throes of this, and parts of that ship have been in it for a very long time. And as part of that podcast, we interviewed some champion sailors, some extraordinary women who have sailed around the world in extremely competitive situations and often by themselves. And they remarked about how there's this huge moment where the expectation that you will sail around shifts, and your mindset has to shift into being able to navigate within a storm. And the work that we've done, and in the derailment risk report we released today, through that we identified 5 competencies that these sailors were talking about. One was the need for better situational awareness. You've got to really know what's going on around you, even more than before. And there's a lot of people here who do a lot of work on how risk assessments are not so good with climate change. You've got to be way more resilient. You've got to be far more adaptive. The ship has got to be strong to be able to do its navigating. But thirdly, you can't just hunker down. You also need to improve your ability to go fast. For climate change, that means, as we were saying, adaptation being co-beneficial to decarbonisation. And then the fourth and fifth competencies that in some ways these sailors were saying were particularly important were stories to make sense of the fact that you now have to navigate within a storm and not just around it. And then the leadership that will enable all of those things, that will keep that crew together, whether in an organization, a community, or the wider world. So I'll leave that there as a kind of framework for how we might think of this moment. And the report that we published is packed full of this more positive, this what can we be doing and where do our wells of agency lie. For those of us in person, we're going to go get a drink. For those of you online, maybe you're going to do that as well, even if it's 4 a.m. I want to say a huge thank you to the Sustainability Accelerator team here at Chatham House, to David, to Ellie, to Matt, and the rest of the team who might be sticking around for drinks as well. Please do come and say hi to them, and they have been invaluable in our work here at the Strategic Climate Risk Initiative. I want to say a big thank you to the European Climate Foundation, whose generous support made this project and this work possible, and to our partners in it, the Institute for Public Policy Research, the Global Systems Institute, the University of Exeter, and the UCL Climate Action Unit, who you will meet upstairs for those of you who are in person. They are next to where we'll have the drinks, and they are going to be giving you a demonstrator of a facilitation tool that we've developed to help you map derailment risks in your own setting and explore how you might tackle them. Very proactive, very positive. So please do pop in to get an idea of how that works. I think I've now said thanks to everyone, and forgive me if I've not said thanks to all the amazing people that we work with all the time. Thank you to you guys online for tuning in, for being here this evening, and I hope to have a drink with you in a moment. So thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you upstairs, those in person, and goodbye to everyone else.